The message arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a quiet Tuesday morning, though nobody on Earth would call it quiet for very long. It came from a listening post near the orbit of Neptune, a small automated station that had been watching the dark for almost 40 years. The station's only job was to listen. It picked up radio noise, gravity ripples, and strange bursts of light that came from deep space. Most of the time it found nothing. This time, it found something. A fleet. The station sent its data back to Earth at the speed of light, which still took over 4 hours to arrive. By the time the report reached Fleet Admiral Elena Voss on her desk in the Geneva Command Center, the fleet it described was already 2 light-years closer than it had been when the station first saw it. Elena read the numbers twice. Then she read them a third time, because the first 2 times, she was sure she had made a mistake. 3,112 ships. She set down her tablet and looked out the window at the gray morning sky over the city. Somewhere up there, past the clouds, past the atmosphere, past the orbit of the moon, an army large enough to blot out stars was moving toward her planet. And Earth had exactly 3 ships capable of meeting it in open space. 3 ships against 3,000. It was not a fair fight. It was not supposed to be a fair fight. The listening post that had first spotted the fleet was called Outpost 7, a small metal box drifting in the cold dark beyond Neptune, tended by nobody, its only company a slow rotation of solar panels and a single antenna pointed out toward the stars. It had been built during a decade when most people on Earth still thought of first contact as science fiction, something that belonged in movies rather than budget meetings. Only a handful of scientists had argued that Earth needed ears in the dark, and even fewer had believed those ears would ever hear anything worth reporting. When Outpost 7's sensors first picked up the gravity wake of 3,000 ships moving through open space, its onboard systems did not panic, because it had no capacity to panic. It simply did what it was built to do. It recorded the data, packaged it, and sent it home, the same as it would have done for a passing comet or a burst of unusual radiation. It had no way of knowing that the message it sent would be read, within hours, by every government on the planet, and that the world it reported to would never quite be the same again. By midday, Elena Voss was no longer alone with the numbers. The United Earth Council had been woken in the middle of the night in a dozen different time zones, pulled from beds and dinners and ordinary lives into an emergency session that would stretch on for nearly 18 hours. Prime ministers, presidents, and representatives who had spent years arguing over trade agreements and fishing rights now sat around the same table, staring at the same terrifying number, and for once in human history, nobody in that room wasted time arguing about which country's flag would fly over the response. "How long until they reach us?" asked the council's rotating chair, a former diplomat from Kenya named Grace Odinga, who had been given the job precisely because she had a talent for keeping meetings from falling apart. "At their current speed," Elena said, 6 days, maybe 7. "And our options?" Elena had looked around the room at faces that ranged from terrified to grimly determined, and had said the only thing she could say honestly. "We do exactly what we planned to do 5 years ago. We send the 3 ships. We trust the plan. And we pray it works, because there isn't a second option that gives us better odds." Nobody in that room had argued. There was nothing left to argue about. 5 years earlier, when the decision had first been made to build something the Dominion would never see coming, rather than something the Dominion could simply outnumber, it had been a gamble born of necessity. Now, with an actual fleet bearing down on their planet, it was the only gamble they had. Humanity had known for 11 years that it was not alone in the galaxy. First contact had not come the way the old movies promised, with bright lights over a city, and a voice from the sky offering peace or war. It came quietly, through a research satellite that picked up an encrypted signal, bouncing off the rings of Saturn. The signal was not meant for human ears. It was a supply request from a small trading ship that had wandered too close to the system, made by a species called the Ashari, who were mapping trade routes on behalf of a much larger power. That larger power called itself the Varathi Dominion. The Dominion was old. Its capital world had been settled while humans were still learning to work bronze. Over thousands of years it had grown by absorbing other species, sometimes through trade and treaties, sometimes through conquest. By the time it found Earth, the Dominion controlled more than 600 inhabited systems and commanded a fleet that numbered in the tens of thousands of ships. The Varathi themselves were tall and thin, with gray skin that shimmered faintly under bright light, and 4 eyes set in a ring around their heads so that they could see in every direction at once. They did not think of themselves as cruel, they thought of themselves as patient. When they found a new species, they watched it for years before making contact, studying its language, its wars, its inventions, deciding whether it was worth the trouble of conquering, or better left as a trading partner. The Dominion's method of expansion had been refined over thousands of years, into something closer to a science than a war. First, they watched. Then they sent traders, offering goods and technology just advanced enough to be tempting, without giving away anything truly valuable. If a species proved cooperative and useful, they were offered membership on terms that sounded generous, but always, in the end, placed real power in Dominion hands. If a species proved difficult, or worse, dangerous, the Dominion sent fleets instead of traders, and those fleets rarely needed to fight more than once before a world surrendered. In 600 years of recorded history, only 4 species in the Dominion's path had ever chosen to resist by force, rather than accept membership through treaty. All 4 had lost, and all 4 were now Dominion worlds, their populations folded into the Empire's endless bureaucracy, their languages preserved mostly in museums and historical records that few Varathi bothered to read. It was a pattern so consistent that Dominion war academies taught it as something close to natural law. Resistance delayed the inevitable, but never prevented it. This was the history that Grand Marshal Threx Kalor carried with him as he approached the Sol system, a history of unbroken success, stretching back further than most human civilizations had existed at all. It was not arrogance exactly that shaped his expectations. It was simply experience. He had seen this story play out before, on a dozen worlds, in a dozen different forms, and every single time, no matter how fierce the initial resistance, the ending had been the same. For 11 years, the Dominion watched Earth. They watched humans fight wars over borders and resources. They watched humans send robots to Mars and satellites past Pluto. They watched humans argue in parliaments and shout in streets, and somehow, slowly, begin to work together in ways the Dominion found almost impossible to predict. Human governments that had once threatened each other with nuclear weapons began sharing space stations. Rival companies that had once sued each other over patents began sharing rocket designs. It was messy. It was loud. It made no sense to a species like the Varathi, who valued order above almost everything else. And then, 1 year ago, the Dominion made its decision. Earth was rich in resources the Dominion needed. It sat in a useful position for extending trade routes deeper into this arm of the galaxy. And its people, while clever, were still flying chemical rockets and building computers out of silicon, technology the Dominion had left behind 10,000 years earlier. The Dominion's High Council voted to bring Earth into the fold, by treaty if the humans were reasonable, and by force if they were not. They sent an ambassador first. His name, translated roughly into human sounds, was Sethranar. He arrived in a single unarmed ship and requested a meeting with Earth's leaders. He offered Earth membership in the Dominion, protection from other predatory species in the galaxy, access to advanced medicine and clean energy technology, all in exchange for Earth's independence, its resources, and its obedience. The leaders of Earth gathered together for the first time in human history under something called the United Earth Council, said no. Sethranar was polite about it. He said he understood, and that the council would be given 6 months to reconsider. Then he left. In those 6 months, Sethranar had not simply waited on some distant Dominion world for Earth to change its mind. He had remained in the system, aboard a small diplomatic vessel stationed near the orbit of Mars, continuing his quiet study of the species he had come to find genuinely fascinating. He watched human news broadcasts, argued with human diplomats over shared meals that neither species particularly enjoyed, and slowly built something that, in another life, might have been called a friendship with several members of the council, including Elena Voss herself. It was during one of those quiet conversations, only weeks before the 6-month deadline expired, that Sethranar had asked her directly whether Earth understood what it was choosing. "You have seen our fleet reports," he had said. "You understand the numbers involved. I am not asking you to change your answer, Admiral. I am asking whether you understand what refusing means." Elena had looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Ambassador, with respect, I don't think you understand what accepting would mean. You're offering us protection and medicine and clean energy, and in exchange you want control of our resources and our obedience. That's not a partnership. That's just a slower kind of conquest. Sethranar had not argued the point. He had simply nodded, the closest thing to a sigh that his species' body language allowed, and said nothing further on the matter until the day the 6 months finally ran out. 6 months later, Earth's answer was still no. That was when the fleet began to move. Grand Marshal Threx Kalor had commanded Dominion fleets for over 300 years, which was still less than half of his expected lifespan. He was not young by Varathi standards, but he was far from old, and in his 3 centuries of service, he had never lost a war. He had crushed rebellions on a dozen worlds. He had broken the will of species far more advanced than these humans appeared to be. He did not expect Earth to be difficult. He had earned his rank the old way, not through politics or family connections, but through nearly a century of frontline service, before ever taking command of a fleet of his own. He had fought in the Cathari Uprising, when an entire subject species tried to break away from the Dominion using stolen warships and outdated weapons, and he had ended that war in 8 months, with fewer losses than any commander before him. He had led the pacification of the Andrai Belt, a scattering of independent mining colonies that had resisted Dominion trade agreements for nearly 2 decades, and had done it so cleanly that the Andrai themselves eventually petitioned to join the Dominion voluntarily, a rare outcome that Varathi historians still studied centuries later. In all that time, across all those campaigns, he had built a reputation among both his own people and the species who had faced him as a commander who did not waste lives carelessly, but who also never lost. It was that reputation, more than any political favor, that had earned him command of the largest single fleet the Dominion had assembled in over a century, sent to bring in a species that Dominion scientists described, in their reports, as primitive but unusually persistent. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion vessel Undying Resolve, and looked at the tactical display floating in the air before him. 3,112 ships, arranged in a formation that stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers, moving steadily toward a small blue and green planet at the edge of a minor star system. His second-in-command, a Varathi officer named Yisith, stood beside him. "Scans confirm it, Grand Marshal," Yisith said. "The humans have exactly 3 warships capable of deep space combat. Their remaining forces are planetary defense platforms, unarmed cargo vessels, and a handful of research craft. Nothing that could meaningfully engage our fleet." Threx studied the numbers for a long moment. 3 ships. It seemed almost like a mistake, or perhaps a joke that the humans did not understand the Varathi could not appreciate. 3 ships, he repeated, against 3,000. "Yes, Grand Marshal. And they know we are coming. Ambassador Sethranar's reports confirm they have tracked our approach for weeks." "They do, Grand Marshal." Threx turned away from the display and looked out through the viewport at the stars ahead, though at this distance, Earth's sun was still nothing more than a slightly brighter point of light among thousands of others. "Then either they are fools," he said quietly, "or they know something we do not." Yisith did not answer right away. In 300 years of service under Threx Kalor, he had learned that his commander's instincts were rarely wrong. But he had also studied the human reports as thoroughly as anyone in the fleet, and he could find no hidden weapon, no secret fleet, no reasonable explanation for why a species facing annihilation would send only 3 ships to meet it. "Our scans of their system are thorough, Grand Marshal," he said finally. "We have found no other warships, no hidden shipyards. Their entire visible military force is those 3 vessels." "Visible," Threx said. "Grand Marshal? You said visible force. That is not the same as their entire force." Yisith considered this. "You believe they are hiding something." "I believe," Threx said, "that no species survives long enough to build starships by being stupid. They have watched us approach for weeks, and they have not fled, and they have not surrendered, and they have not begged for terms. They have sent 3 ships to meet 3,000. That is not the behavior of a frightened animal. That is the behavior of something that believes it can win." He was quiet for a moment, his 4 eyes taking in the full sweep of the tactical display, the endless formation of Dominion warships stretching out behind his flagship like a wall of iron. Increase our sensor sweeps, he said. Double the escort around the flagship, and send word to the fleet. No ship engages the enemy alone. Whatever the humans are planning, we will not give them the chance to use it against a divided force. Yes, Grand Marshal, Yisith said, and turned to relay the orders. Threx remained by the viewport a moment longer, watching the distant light that was Earth's sun, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt uncertain. Back on Earth, in the underground command center beneath the city of Geneva, Fleet Admiral Elena Voss stood in front of a wall of screens, showing the same tactical data that filled Grand Marshal Threx's display, 3 light hours away, delayed and pieced together from a chain of relay satellites scattered across the outer solar system. Around her, dozens of officers and engineers moved between workstations, speaking quietly into headsets, adjusting numbers on glowing screens. The room smelled like coffee and burnt electronics. Nobody had slept much in the last 3 days. Elena was 51 years old, with short gray hair and lines around her eyes that had not been there 5 years earlier, before the Dominion arrived and changed everything about her life and everyone else's. She had spent 30 years in various national navies before the United Earth Council was formed, and she still sometimes found it strange to think of herself as commanding the defense of an entire planet rather than a single fleet from a single country. Confirm the numbers again, she said, without turning around. A young officer named Diego Ferreira, sitting at the main tracking station, read from his screen. 3,112 ships confirmed, Admiral. Formation is standard Dominion approach pattern, tight and defensive. They're not spreading out. They're keeping the whole fleet together. They're being careful, Elena said. Should we be worried they're being careful? I'd be more worried if they weren't, she said. Beside her, a man in a rumpled gray suit set down his own tablet and rubbed his eyes. His name was Dr. Aidan Marsh, the head of Earth's Defense Technology Program, and, as far as Elena was concerned, the single most important civilian on the planet right now. He looked more like a tired professor than the architect of humanity's last line of defense, but appearances had never been his strong point. Status on the 3 ships? Elena asked him. Vanguard, Nightfall, and Prometheus are all fully operational, Aidan said. Crews are in position. Systems check out at 98% across the board, which is about as good as we're going to get, given how fast we had to finish the build. And the rest of it? Aidan hesitated, just slightly, before answering. The network is ready. As ready as it's going to be. We've tested every piece we could test, without giving away that it exists. The only test we haven't run is the real one. Elena nodded slowly. She understood what he meant, and she understood the risk. Everything humanity had built over the last 5 years, every secret they had kept from the Dominion's ambassador, and every advantage they had tried to hide from Dominion scans, all of it came down to a plan that had never been tried in actual combat. If it failed, 3,000 ships would be over Earth within days, and there would be nothing left to stop them. 3 ships, she said quietly, almost to herself. 3 ships, Aidan agreed. But Admiral, you know as well as I do, it was never really about the 3 ships. She looked at him. No, it wasn't. Across the room, a comm officer raised her hand. Admiral, we have an incoming transmission request. It's Ambassador Sethranar. He's asking to speak with the Council one more time before the fleet arrives. Elena straightened her uniform jacket and took a slow breath. Patch him through, she said. Let's hear what he has to say. The image that appeared on the main screen a moment later showed Sethranar sitting in a plain white room aboard a Dominion diplomatic vessel somewhere near the edge of the system. He looked tired, or at least what passed for tired among his species, his 4 eyes slightly dimmer than usual, his gray skin looking pale under the harsh light of his cabin. Admiral Voss, he said, his translated voice flat and careful, the way it always was. Thank you for accepting my call. Ambassador, Elena said, you have 3,000 warships approaching my planet. I assume this isn't a social visit. It is not, Sethranar said. I have been instructed to offer Earth one final opportunity to accept membership in the Dominion before the fleet engages. Grand Marshal Kalor has authorized me to say that if your council agrees to the original terms, the fleet will halt its advance immediately, and no lives need be lost. And if we say no again? Sethranar was quiet for a moment. Then the Grand Marshal has orders to take the system by force. I have seen what happens to worlds that resist the Dominion, Admiral. I do not wish to see it happen here. In the years I have spent studying your people, I have come to believe humanity has something worth preserving. I am asking you, not as a representative of the Dominion, but as someone who has watched your species for over a decade, to reconsider. Elena studied the alien's face on the screen, searching for any hint of deception, and finding, as she usually did with Sethranar, something that looked uncomfortably close to sincerity. I appreciate that, Ambassador, she said. I really do. But you already know our answer. We gave it to you 6 months ago, and nothing has changed since then. 3 ships, Admiral, Sethranar said, and for the first time in 11 years of contact between their species, Elena heard something that might have been genuine confusion in his translated voice. You are sending 3 ships against 3,000. I do not understand what you hope to accomplish. Elena allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Ambassador, she said, with respect, that's exactly the point. You don't understand. And in about 6 hours, your Grand Marshal is going to find out why that matters more than the number of ships in his fleet. Sethranar's 4 eyes narrowed slightly. An expression Elena had learned over the years meant something close to human worry. I hope, for both our sakes, that you know what you are doing, he said. So do I, Elena said quietly, after the connection had already closed. So do I. 6 hours later, the Dominion fleet crossed the outer edge of the Sol system, past the cold rocks and ice of the Kuiper Belt, into the space that humanity had spent 5 years quietly preparing. On the bridge of the Undying Resolve, Grand Marshal Threx Kalor watched as 3 small points of light detached themselves from Earth's defensive perimeter and began moving to meet his fleet. 3 ships, against 3,000. Bring the fleet to combat readiness, he said. Let us see what the humans have been hiding. Behind him, 3,112 Dominion warships began to power their weapons, unaware that they had already sailed into a trap 5 years in the making. The 3 ships that flew out to meet the Dominion fleet did not look like much. By Varathi standards, they were small, barely a quarter of the size of an average Dominion cruiser. They had no elegant curves, no glowing energy shields visible from the outside, none of the quiet menace that Dominion warships carried after 10,000 years of refinement. They looked, to the sensor operators watching from the Undying Resolve, almost unfinished, blocky, practical, like something built in a hurry by people who cared more about function than appearance. Their names, translated from human records intercepted by Dominion listening posts, were Vanguard, Nightfall, and Prometheus. The Vanguard was the largest of the 3, built to lead and to take the heaviest damage. Its captain was a woman named Sarah Cade, 44 years old, a veteran of Earth's old national navies, who had transferred into the United Earth Fleet the day it was formed. She had spent the last 3 years training for exactly this moment, running simulations so many times that she sometimes dreamed about tactical displays instead of her own house. The Nightfall was smaller and faster, built for speed and precision rather than raw power. Its captain, Tomas Reyes, was younger than Cade by almost 15 years, a former fighter pilot who had transitioned to Starship Command when Earth's military restructured around the Dominion threat. He was known among his crew for staying calm in situations that made everyone else want to scream. The Prometheus was the strangest of the 3 ships, at least to anyone who understood what it actually was. From the outside, it looked like a slightly larger version of the Nightfall, with similar engines and a similar hull. But almost half of its internal space was not given over to weapons or crew quarters. It was given over to computers. Its captain, Amara Osei, had once been a systems engineer before the war began, and she understood the ship's true purpose better than almost anyone else in the fleet. Osei had grown up in Accra, the daughter of 2 teachers who had never imagined their daughter would end up commanding what was, in practice, the most powerful computer system Earth had ever built, wrapped in the shell of a starship. She had studied network engineering at university, with no particular interest in space or the military, planning instead on a quiet career building systems for hospitals and power grids. First Contact had changed that plan, along with everyone else's. When Aiden Marsh's recruiters came looking for engineers who understood how to make thousands of small, independent systems work together as one, her name had come up again and again, and within a year, She had gone from designing hospital networks to designing the nervous system of humanity's last line of defense. She did not think of herself as a warrior, and she never really would, even after the battle that was about to begin. She thought of herself as someone who understood how small things, working together with the right kind of coordination, could accomplish what no single large thing ever could. It was the same principle that let a beehive outthink any single bee, and it was the principle she had spent 5 years building into the Prometheus's systems, one careful line of code at a time. The three captains had trained together for years before this day, first in simulations, then in increasingly realistic live exercises conducted quietly in the outer solar system, far from any Dominion sensors that might have caught wind of what Earth was really building. They had come from different backgrounds and different corners of the planet, but the years of shared preparation had turned them into something closer to family than colleagues, the kind of unspoken trust that let them coordinate a battle across 3 separate ships, almost without needing to speak. The 3 captains sat in their separate ships, watching the same tactical display that showed the full weight of the Dominion fleet spread out before them like a wall of stars. "All ships, report status," Cade said, over the shared command channel, her voice steady, despite the numbers on her screen. "Nightfall, ready," Reyes said. "Prometheus, ready," Osei said. "Network link is stable. All nodes responding." Cade allowed herself a small breath. "Copy that. Remember the plan. We are not here to win a battle of numbers. We were never going to win a battle of numbers. We are here to make them think they understand what they're facing, right up until the moment they don't." 5 years earlier, in the first frightened weeks after Earth learned that a fleet the size of a small nation's entire population was somewhere out there in the dark, waiting to decide humanity's future, a very different kind of meeting had taken place in a converted aircraft hangar outside of Colorado Springs. Dr. Aidan Marsh, then a mid-level engineer working on satellite communications, had been called into a room with 24 of the smartest people Earth's various space agencies and defense departments could find on short notice: physicists, computer scientists, former fighter pilots. A woman who had spent her career studying swarm behavior in insects, a retired admiral who had once commanded a fleet of aircraft carriers and now looked deeply unhappy to be in a room full of civilians. The problem in front of them was simple to describe and almost impossible to solve. Humanity could not build 3,000 warships in 5 years. It did not have the resources, the shipyards, the trained crews, or the raw materials. Even working every factory on the planet around the clock, even pooling every nation's military budget into a single project, the math simply did not work. The Dominion had a 10,000-year head start, and there was no way to close that gap through brute force. So they stopped trying to close it through brute force. The idea that eventually won out came from an unlikely combination of people. It started with the swarm behavior researcher, whose name was Dr. Priya Nandan, describing how ant colonies and beehives could accomplish things far beyond the capability of any single insect. Not through individual strength, but through coordination, communication, and numbers that moved and thought as one. It grew when a computer scientist named Wen Zhao pointed out that Earth's greatest advantage over the Dominion was not military hardware, but software. Humanity had spent the last century building some of the most advanced computing and networking systems in known space, mostly for reasons that had nothing to do with warfare, and almost none of it looked anything like a weapon. The plan they eventually built was this. Instead of building 3,000 warships, Earth would build thousands of small, cheap, mostly unmanned combat drones, along with an enormous network of automated defense platforms hidden throughout the solar system, disguised as mining equipment, research stations, and dead satellites. None of these things, on their own, would be a match for a single Dominion warship, but they would not need to fight on their own. They would be linked together, in real time, by a command network more advanced than anything the Dominion had ever encountered, controlled and directed by 3 crewed ships acting as the network's living command nodes. The 3 ships would be the brain. Thousands of hidden drones and defense platforms scattered across the system, invisible to Dominion sensors until the moment they activated, would be the body. "We're not building a fleet to match theirs," Aidan Marsh had said, standing in front of that room full of exhausted, frightened experts 5 years earlier. "We're building a fleet they can't see coming, and we're going to let them count our ships and feel confident, right up until the moment their confidence gets them killed. The retired admiral in the room, a stern man named James Whitfield, who had spent 40 years believing that naval power was measured in tonnage and gun barrels, had not been easy to convince. He had argued for weeks that Earth needed to build real warships, as many as possible, as fast as possible, even if the numbers would never come close to matching the Dominion. Better a real fleet that could be seen and respected, he argued, than a gamble built on hidden tricks that might fail the very first time they were tested in actual combat. It was Elena Voss, then still a rising officer rather than the fleet admiral she would become, who had finally settled the argument. "Admiral Whitfield," she had said, "you're right that a hidden trick can fail. But a fleet of 100 ships against 3,000 doesn't fail slowly, it fails in the first 10 minutes, and everyone in it dies for nothing. I'd rather bet on something clever that might not work, than something honest that definitely won't." Whitfield had not liked the answer, but in the end, he had not been able to argue with the math. He spent the following years overseeing the construction of the 3 crewed ships instead, pouring every ounce of his old-fashioned naval experience into making sure Vanguard, Nightfall, and Prometheus were as tough and reliable as anything humanity had ever built, even if their true purpose was never to win the battle alone. It had taken 5 years, thousands of engineers, and resources from every nation on Earth, working together for the first time in human history. It had required convincing the Dominion, through careful management of what their scans could detect, that Earth's visible fleet was its entire fleet. It had meant building thousands of drones that looked, on Dominion sensors, like harmless debris, asteroids, or civilian equipment, until the exact moment they were activated. It also meant secrecy on a scale that no human project had ever required before. Fewer than 2,000 people on the entire planet knew the full shape of the plan. Factory workers building strange, unmarked components in dozens of countries were told only what they needed to know to do their jobs, never how their pieces fit into the larger whole. Cargo manifests were falsified. Shipping routes were disguised. An entire shadow industry grew up around the project, hidden inside legitimate mining and satellite companies, moving material through the solar system in ways that looked, to any outside observer, like nothing more than ordinary commercial activity. Twice during those 5 years, Dominion trade observers had come close to noticing something unusual, and twice, quiet diplomatic and economic maneuvering had smoothed over the questions before they became serious investigations. Elena Voss had spent almost as much time managing those close calls as she had spent on military planning, aware that a single serious leak could unravel 5 years of work in a matter of days. And now, 5 years later, it was about to be tested for the first time against an actual enemy. Grand Marshal Threx Kaller watched the 3 small human ships approach his fleet, and felt the same uneasy sensation he had felt since first seeing the numbers. 3 against 3,000. It made no tactical sense unless the humans knew something he did not. "Orders, Grand Marshal?" Yisith asked. "Hold formation," Threx said. "Do not advance further. Let them come to us. I want every sensor in the fleet focused on those 3 vessels. If they are hiding something, I want to know before it can be used against us." Understood. The human ships continued their approach, closing the distance steadily, without any sign of hesitation or fear. Threx found this more troubling than almost anything else. A frightened enemy made mistakes. A frightened enemy hesitated, or turned back, or begged for mercy. These 3 ships did none of that. They came forward like they had somewhere specific to be. "Grand Marshal," a sensor officer called out. "The lead human vessel is transmitting. Audio only, no video. Put it through." A moment later, a human voice filled the bridge of the undying resolve, translated a half-second later into the Varathi language by the ship's own systems. "This is Captain Sarah Cade, of the Earth vessel Vanguard, addressing the commander of the Dominion fleet. You have 3,000 ships, we have 3. I imagine you're wondering why we bothered to show up at all." Threx said nothing, watching the tactical display. "We're here," Cade continued, "because Earth already told your ambassador no once, and we meant it. You're welcome to turn your fleet around and go home. That offer's still on the table. If you don't, you're about to learn something about us that your scans couldn't tell you." The transmission ended. Yisith looked at his commander. "Confidence or bravado?" "I do not know yet," Threx said slowly. "But I would rather find out cautiously than find out too late. Order the fleet to maintain full defensive formation. No ship breaks off alone. regardless of what happens next, and prepare the forward battle line. If they wish to test us, we will let them. On our terms, not theirs. Aboard the Vanguard, Sarah Cade closed the comm channel and allowed herself the smallest, tightest smile.
That should get their attention,
she said. Osei, how's the network looking? Nominal. Osei's voice came back over the link. Every node in the system is reporting green. We're about to test 5 years of work in the next 20 minutes, Captain. I hope everyone back on Earth remembered to double-check their math. They did, Reyes cut in from the nightfall. I checked it myself about 400 times. Comforting, Cade said dryly. All ships, begin approach Vector 3. Let's give the Grand Marshal a closer look at what he's dealing with. The 3 human ships adjusted course slightly, moving not directly toward the main body of the Dominion fleet, but along its outer edge, skirting the formation at a distance that was close enough to seem provocative, but far enough to seem cautious. It was, in fact, exactly the distance the network required. Scattered throughout the outer solar system, disguised among asteroid fields and drifting debris, hidden inside decommissioned research satellites and mining rigs that the Dominion scans had long ago dismissed as harmless, thousands of small objects began, very quietly, to wake up. They did not move yet. They did not power their engines or activate their weapons. They simply opened their sensors, established their connection to the network humming silently between the 3 human ships, and waited. On the bridge of the Undying Resolve, none of this registered as anything unusual. Dominion sensors, calibrated over 10,000 years to detect warships, engines, and weapons signatures, saw nothing but the same debris and dead satellites they had already cataloged and dismissed hours earlier. The human ships continue along the edge of our formation, Yisith reported. No change in their behavior, no weapons fire, no unusual energy signatures beyond their main engines. Curious, Threx said. Continue monitoring. And Yisith, contact Ambassador Sethranar. I want his assessment of human tactical doctrine, if such a thing exists in any records we have gathered over the last 11 years. A few minutes later, Sethranar's face appeared on a secondary display, looking as tired and uncertain as he had during his last transmission to Earth. Grand Marshal, he said, you wish to speak with me. You have studied these humans longer than anyone else in the Dominion, Threx said. Their 3 ships approach my fleet with a confidence that does not match the numbers I am seeing on my tactical display. Explain this to me. Sethranar was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Grand Marshal, in 11 years of observation, I have found that humans rarely act without a reason, even when that reason is not immediately visible. They argue constantly among themselves, yes, and their politics are chaotic, in ways I still do not fully understand. But when they commit to a course of action as a unified species, as they have here, it is rarely out of desperation. It is because they believe they have found a way to win. And do you believe they have? Sethranar hesitated. I do not know, Grand Marshal. I was not given access to their defense projects. I only know that for the last 5 years, human industrial output on materials with no obvious civilian use has increased in ways that were never fully explained to Dominion trade observers. I flagged this in my reports 3 years ago. I do not know what became of that information. Threx's 4 eyes narrowed. I have not seen this report. It would have gone to the Trade Assessment Office, Grand Marshal, not to Fleet Command. I assumed it was reviewed. Threx said nothing for a long moment, staring at the tactical display where 3 small human ships continued their slow, deliberate path along the edge of his overwhelming fleet. He thought back to a report he had read only briefly, weeks earlier, from a junior intelligence officer who had noted, almost as an afterthought, that human shipping patterns throughout their solar system had grown unusually complex over the last several years, with cargo vessels making runs to the outer asteroid belt that did not seem to correspond to any known mining operation. The report had been filed under routine trade anomalies and had never reached his desk directly. He wondered now how many other small, easily dismissed details had been quietly building toward this moment, while the Dominion's attention remained fixed on the visible, and comfortably manageable, threat of 3 warships. Isith, he said finally, signal the fleet, all ships, maximum sensor alert. I want every asteroid, every piece of debris, every dead satellite within 10 million kilometers, rescanned immediately. If the humans have hidden something in this system, I want it found before it can be used. Yes, Grand Marshal, Yisith said, already relaying the order. But even as the Dominion's sensor operators began their frantic rescan of the surrounding space, the human network had already finished waking up. Thousands of hidden nodes, quietly linked to the 3 ships moving along the fleet's edge, stood ready, invisible, and waiting for a single command. On the Vanguard's bridge, Sarah Cade watched a status display shift from a single word, waiting, to another. Ready. She looked at the tactical display, at the endless wall of 3,000 Dominion warships, and felt something settle in her chest, not quite calm, but close to it. All ships, she said quietly into the command channel, hold position. We wait for their move first. Let them come to us. Behind her, on the Vanguard's small crew deck, the rest of the ship's skeleton crew went about their duties with the particular quiet focus of people who understood exactly how much rested on the next few hours. There were only 12 people aboard the Vanguard, a fraction of what a ship its size might have carried in an earlier age of naval warfare, because most of its internal systems had been designed to run with minimal crew, freeing up space and mass for the network relay equipment that made the ship's true purpose possible. Every one of those 12 people had trained for this moment for years. Every one of them understood that if the network failed, there would be no second plan waiting behind it. Cade thought, briefly, of her daughter, 16 years old, and staying with her grandparents in a shelter beneath what used to be a mountain resort in Colorado, along with millions of other children evacuated from major cities in the days before the fleet's arrival. She had told her daughter, before leaving for the Vanguard, that she would be home soon, and she had meant it as more than just something a mother says to comfort a frightened child. She had genuinely believed, as much as anyone could believe in an untested plan, that Earth's 5 years of quiet, desperate preparation would be enough. She hoped she was right. Somewhere in the dark around them, thousands of hidden weapons waited silently for the order that would turn a battle that looked impossible to win into something else entirely. The rescanned Grand Marshal Threx Kalor ordered took almost 40 minutes to complete, across a volume of space as large as the outer solar system, even with 3,000 ships contributing their sensors to the effort. When it finished, the results came back exactly the way the first scan had: debris, dead satellites, old mining equipment, abandoned decades ago when Earth's asteroid mining companies had gone bankrupt during the economic chaos that followed first contact. Nothing that matched any known weapons signature, nothing that moved, or powered up, or gave any sign of being anything other than what it appeared to be. Nothing, Grand Marshal, Yisith reported, unable to keep a note of relief out of his translated voice. The rescan confirms the original results. No hidden vessels, no unusual power signatures. The debris fields are exactly what they appear to be. Threx studied the tactical display for a long moment, the wall of his own fleet, the 3 small human ships still moving slowly along its edge, and the thousands of scattered points that Dominion sensors insisted were nothing more than space junk. And yet, he said, Ambassador Sethranar reports unexplained industrial activity for 5 years. Explain that to me, alongside your nothing, Yisith. Yisith had no answer for that. Across the fleet, on the bridges of 2,000 other Dominion warships, similar conversations were taking place, among captains and crews who had grown restless during the long approach and now found themselves staring at an enemy that refused to behave the way a hopelessly outmatched enemy was supposed to behave. Dominion doctrine, refined over 10,000 years of successful conquest, had no clean category for 3 ships that showed no fear, no hesitation, and no interest in fleeing or surrendering. Junior officers whispered among themselves about ancient legends of species that had once fought the Dominion to a standstill through trickery rather than strength. Stories most Varathi considered closer to myth than history. A few of the older captains, veterans of campaigns even Threx had not fought in, found themselves thinking of those old stories more seriously than they had in centuries. On the undying resolve, Threx allowed himself a rare moment of genuine reflection. He had built his entire career on reading an enemy correctly before committing his forces, and every instinct honed over 300 years told him that something about this situation did not fit the pattern he expected. And yet every scan, every sensor sweep, every scrap of hard data available to him said there was nothing to find. It was, he thought, an uncomfortable position for a commander who had never before doubted his own instruments. Maintain full alert status, Threx said, We do not fire first. Let them show their hand. Whatever it is. Order the forward line to hold position, and continue tracking the 3 human vessels. If they attempt to strike, I want a response ready within seconds. Aboard the Vanguard, Sarah Cade watched the same rescan happen on her own tactical display, translated and relayed through Dominion communications that Earth's intelligence teams had been quietly monitoring for years. She allowed herself a small, tired smile as the scan came back clean. They found nothing, she said. Good. That means the stealth coding held. Osei, confirm network status. All nodes still reading green. Osei's voice came back. Every drone, every platform, every hidden weapon in this system is exactly where it's supposed to be, doing exactly nothing, waiting for the word. Captain, whenever you're ready, I can hand you activation authority. Cade looked at the small red switch on her console, protected under a clear plastic cover, the kind of old-fashioned physical safeguard that engineers had insisted on including, even in a ship full of the most advanced computer systems Earth had ever built. Some decisions, they had argued, should never be left entirely to software. Not yet, she said. We wait for them to commit to something first. I want the Grand Marshal convinced we're bluffing before we prove otherwise. Reyes, how's Nightfall looking? Ready and steady, Captain, Reyes said. Engines are warm. Whenever the dance starts, we're not going to be the ones stepping on toes. Good, Cade said, because in about 10 minutes, I think they're going to stop being patient. She looked around the small, cramped bridge of the Vanguard, at the handful of crew members monitoring systems that stretched far beyond the walls of their own ship, out into the dark where thousands of hidden weapons waited for a single word. 5 years of simulations had prepared her for almost every version of this moment she could imagine, but no simulation could fully capture the strange stillness of actually waiting, in real time, for an enemy commander 300 light-years more experienced than herself, to make the first mistake. You ever think about what happens if this doesn't work? Asked Lieutenant James Okafor, the Vanguard's young tactical officer, not looking up from his console. Every day for the last 5 years, Cade admitted. But thinking about it, and letting it change what I do next, are 2 different things, Lieutenant. Keep your eyes on the board. Yes, Captain. She was right. Grand Marshal Threx Kaller had commanded fleets for 300 years, and in 300 years, he had learned that patience, while valuable, had limits. His scans found nothing. His fleet outnumbered the enemy 1,000 to 1, and 3 small human ships continued to sit at the edge of his formation, doing nothing but watching, as if they had all the time in the galaxy. He would not allow himself to be made to wait indefinitely by an enemy, with a fraction of his strength. Isith, he said, signal the forward line. I want a probing strike. 20 ships, moving to engage the human vessel designated Nightfall, the smallest and fastest of the 3. If it is a trap, 20 ships is an acceptable loss to learn its shape. If it is not, we end this quickly. Yes, Grand Marshal. 20 Dominion cruisers broke away from the main formation and began accelerating toward the Nightfall, their weapons charging, energy shields flaring to life around their hulls. On the bridge of the Nightfall, Tomas Reyes watched them come with the same calm focus he had carried through years of fighter pilot training. 20 ships inbound, he reported over the command channel. They're targeting me specifically. Guess I drew the short straw. Copy that, Cade said. Evasive pattern only. Do not engage directly. Let's see what they can actually do before we show them anything. Copy, Reyes said, already adjusting course. The Nightfall was built for exactly this kind of moment. Its engines, smaller and lighter than those on larger warships, gave it a speed and maneuverability that the bulkier Dominion cruisers could not easily match. As the 20 ships closed in and opened fire, Reyes guided his ship through a series of tight, unpredictable turns, using the Nightfall's superior agility to avoid the worst of the incoming fire, while its shields absorbed the glancing hits that could not be dodged entirely. For the first few minutes, it looked, to anyone watching from the undying resolve, like exactly the kind of hopeless mismatch the numbers suggested. 20 ships against 1, and the 1 ship simply running, dodging, surviving, rather than fighting back. Reyes had spent years flying fighters before ever taking command of a starship, first in national air forces and later in the earliest prototype spacecraft built during humanity's first uncertain years of space combat training. He knew, Better than almost anyone in the fleet, how to read the pattern of an enemy's fire, how to predict a turn, half a second before it happened, how to make a slower, weaker ship survive against faster, stronger opponents, simply by never quite being where they expected him to be. It was a skill that no simulation could fully teach, something closer to instinct built through thousands of hours of practice, and in this moment it was the only thing standing between the nightfall and destruction. "They're adjusting their targeting pattern," he reported, weaving through another burst of incoming fire. "Getting smarter. I don't think I can keep this up much longer without taking real damage." "Just a little longer," Cade said again, watching her own display where the debris fields around the engagement were beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change. "Shields at 82%, Reyes reported, his voice tight but controlled as he threw the nightfall into another sharp turn. "They're persistent, I'll give them that." "Hold pattern," Cade said, "just a little longer." On the bridge of the Undying Resolve, Yisith watched the engagement with growing confidence. "The human vessel shows impressive maneuverability, Grand Marshal, but it cannot evade indefinitely. Our ships will wear down its shields eventually." Threx said nothing, watching closely. Something about the human ship's movements bothered him, though he could not immediately say why. It was not fighting defensively out of desperation. It was fighting the way a scout fights, buying time, gathering information, waiting for something. "Grand Marshal," Yisith said suddenly, "sensor readings from the debris fields near the 20 engaged cruisers. Something is changing." Threx turned his attention to the secondary display, where the debris fields that had shown nothing during 2 full sensor sweeps were now showing something else entirely. Dozens, then hundreds of the small objects that had been catalogued as harmless space junk were beginning to move, their engines flaring to life in the darkness, their true shapes becoming clear, as the stealth coatings that had hidden them for years finally deactivated. "Grand Marshal," Yisith said, his voice losing its earlier confidence, "those are weapons platforms. Hundreds of them. They were disguised as debris, and they are now powering up directly around our forward strike force." Threx felt the cold certainty of understanding settle over him. "Order the 20 ships to retreat," he said sharply. "Immediately." The order came too late. On the Vanguard, Sarah Cade watched the status display shift, and this time she did not hesitate. She flipped open the plastic cover over the small red switch on her console and pressed it. "Network active," she said. "All units, engage." Around the 20 Dominion cruisers still chasing the nightfall, the hundreds of hidden weapons platforms that had spent 5 years disguised as harmless debris opened fire simultaneously, their combined firepower far exceeding what any 20 ships could withstand, no matter how advanced their shields. It was over in less than 90 seconds. The 20 Dominion cruisers, caught in a crossfire from every direction, their shields never designed to withstand an attack from hundreds of coordinated sources at once, were destroyed almost as quickly as they had engaged. A few managed to break away and retreat toward the main fleet, their hulls scarred and systems failing, but most simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the combined firepower of a network the Dominion had never even known was there. On the bridge of the Undying Resolve, silence fell as the tactical display updated in real time, 20 green markers representing Dominion warships winking out one after another. "Grand Marshal," Yisith said quietly, "we have lost the entire strike force." Threx Kalor stared at the display, at the hundreds of newly revealed weapons platforms scattered throughout what he had believed was empty space, at the 3 human ships still sitting calmly at the edge of his formation, apparently untouched by the engagement they had just won so completely. 300 years, he said quietly, and I have never seen anything like this. He thought, briefly, of the ancient stories he had dismissed as myth only hours earlier, tales of species that had defeated Dominion fleets, not through strength, but through cunning, through patience, through a willingness to let an enemy underestimate them, until it was too late to matter. He had always believed those stories were exaggerations, the kind of thing that grew in the telling across generations. But standing on his own bridge watching 20 warships vanish in less than 2 minutes, he found himself taking them far more seriously than he ever had before. Around the bridge, Dominion officers who had spent their entire careers within a fleet that had never known real defeat worked in a silence that carried an unfamiliar weight. Some kept their eyes fixed rigidly on their consoles, unwilling to look up at the tactical display, and see the gap where 20 friendly markers had been only minutes earlier. A few of the younger officers, barely a century old, had never witnessed the Dominion lose more than a handful of ships in any single engagement in their entire lifetimes, and the shock on their faces was not something Threx could easily ignore. "Orders, Grand Marshal?" Isith asked, and for the first time in all his years serving under Threx Calor, his voice carried something close to fear. Threx was quiet for a long moment, studying the numbers. Even with hundreds of hidden weapons platforms revealed, the Dominion fleet still outnumbered the visible human forces by an enormous margin. 3,000 ships remained. A few hundred new weapons platforms, however dangerous, could not realistically stand against that kind of overwhelming force in a direct, sustained engagement. Or so the numbers suggested. "Full fleet advance," Threx said finally. "We will not be baited into piecemeal engagements again. The entire fleet moves together, all weapons free, and we will overwhelm whatever they have hidden through sheer force, rather than caution. I will not lose this system to a trick, however clever." "Yes, Grand Marshal," Isith said, and the order went out across the fleet. 3,092 remaining Dominion warships began to move forward as one, their combined weapons array powering up, an overwhelming tide of firepower aimed directly at the small human network that had just cost them 20 ships in less than 2 minutes. Aboard the Vanguard, Sarah Cade watched the entire Dominion fleet begin its advance, and felt her pulse quicken, despite months of preparation for exactly this moment. "Here they come," she said. "All units, this is it. Osei, status?" "Full network engaged," Osei confirmed, her voice tight with concentration, as she monitored thousands of individual data streams flowing through the Prometheus's systems. "Every hidden platform in the system is online. Every drone is armed and coordinated. Captain, we have 3,000 ships bearing down on us, and I need to tell you honestly, our numbers still don't favor us in a straight fight." "It was never going to be a straight fight," Cade said. "That's the whole point. Reyes, report." "Nightfall's still in one piece," Reyes said, his voice carrying the strain of the last few minutes of high-speed maneuvering. "Shields at 60%, but we're mobile and ready. Whatever's next, I'm in." Cade looked at the tactical display, at the enormous wall of Dominion warships now moving as a single overwhelming mass toward her tiny fleet, and thought about the 5 years of work, the thousands of engineers, the impossible math that had somehow, through sheer human stubbornness and ingenuity, been made to work. She thought about the late nights in that converted hangar outside Colorado Springs, about Priya Nandan sketching insect colonies on a whiteboard, while a room full of exhausted admirals tried to understand how ants without a single leader could accomplish things no individual ant ever could. She thought about Wen Zhao's stubborn insistence that software, not steel, would be humanity's real weapon, an idea that had sounded almost laughably modest next to the scale of the Dominion fleet, and that now stood as the only thing between 3,000 warships and the planet she had sworn to defend. She thought about every engineer who had worked double shifts, building components they were never told the full purpose of. Every factory worker who had assembled strange parts without asking questions. Every dollar and euro and yuan and rupee that governments once too proud to cooperate had finally, out of pure necessity, pooled together into a single desperate project. None of them were here on this bridge, but all of them, in a very real sense, were about to fight this battle alongside her. "All units," she said, her voice steady despite everything, "prepare for full engagement. We're not fighting 3,000 ships today. We're fighting a fleet that doesn't know it's already lost. Let's remind them why that matters." On the undying resolve, Grand Marshal Threx Calor gave the order to advance, with a steadiness in his voice that did not fully match the uncertainty he felt inside. 300 years of experience told him that overwhelming force, applied correctly, could break almost any defense eventually. But some small, quiet part of him, the same part that had noticed the strange calm in Captain Cade's voice during her first transmission, wondered whether this battle might finally be the exception to everything he had learned in 3 centuries of unbroken victory. Behind him, across a formation that stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers, 3,092 Dominion warships began accelerating toward a network of enemies they could not fully see, guided by a commander who, for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, was no longer entirely certain of the outcome. The Dominion fleet closed the distance, an unstoppable tide of iron and fire, bearing down on 3 small human ships and a network of hidden weapons scattered across the dark. On both sides, everyone understood that whatever happened in the next several minutes would decide far more than the fate of a single battle. It would decide whether Earth remained free or became one more world, absorbed into the endless, patient expansion of the Varathi Dominion. 3,092 Dominion warships moved forward together, a wall of metal and weapons fire that stretched across tens of thousands of kilometers of space. On the bridge of the Undying Resolve, Grand Marshal Threx Kaller watched the tactical display with 4 eyes that had seen 300 years of warfare and had never seen anything that troubled him quite like this. Full weapons range in 90 seconds, Yusith reported. All ships confirm readiness. Fire the moment we are in range, Threx said. Concentrate everything on the confirmed weapons platforms first. Whatever advantage the humans believe they hold, we will burn through it with sheer weight of fire. The fleet advanced. 90 seconds passed in tense silence on both sides. Across the vast Dominion formation, weapons officers on nearly 3,000 ships ran the same final checks, charged the same banks of energy cannons, and locked targeting systems onto coordinates relayed from the flagship. It was a display of coordination that had taken the Dominion thousands of years to perfect. An entire fleet moving and firing as though it were a single vast organism, rather than 3,000 separate crews scattered across an enormous stretch of space. On any other battlefield, against any other enemy the Dominion had faced in living memory, this kind of coordinated assault would have ended the fight within minutes. Then the Dominion fleet opened fire, and space itself seemed to light up with the combined weapons of 3,000 ships, a storm of energy and projectiles aimed at the scattered weapons platforms and the 3 small human ships at the network's heart. Aboard the Prometheus, Amara Osei's hands moved rapidly across her console as the first wave of Dominion fire lit up her sensors. This was the moment 5 years of work had been building toward, and everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Incoming fire, multiple vectors, she called out. Network taking hits across 200 nodes. Shields holding on primary platforms. But Captain, we're going to start losing some of the outer network fast, if this keeps up. Understood, Cade said from the Vanguard. Osei, execute the redistribution protocol. Let's see if 5 years of Priya Nandan's swarm research pays off. Executing now. Cade watched her own displays flicker as the redistribution protocol took hold across the network, thousands of individual data points reorganizing themselves in real time, according to rules that no single human mind could have tracked manually. It was, in its own strange way, beautiful to watch, even in the middle of the most dangerous moment of her life, a vast and complicated dance of machines, responding to threats faster than any human commander could have ordered them to. Captain, Okafor said from his station, core network platforms holding steady. Outer platforms taking the worst of it, but the redistribution is keeping losses lower than projected. Keep me updated the moment that changes, Cade said. This was the second piece of the plan the team back on Earth had spent 5 years building, the piece that made the network more than just a large collection of individual weapons. Each of the thousands of hidden platforms scattered throughout the system was capable of operating alone, but they were far more effective working together, sharing targeting data instantly, redistributing power and firepower in real time, based on where the Dominion fleet concentrated its attacks. As the outer platforms began taking heavy fire, the network automatically shifted its defensive priorities, routing power away from platforms under less pressure and toward those closest to being overwhelmed, while simultaneously redirecting offensive fire toward the specific Dominion ships causing the most damage. It was not unlike the way a hive of insects might respond to a threat. No single point of control, no single weakness that could be exploited, just thousands of small parts working together as a single, adaptable whole. On the Dominion side, the effect was immediately disorienting. Ships that had appeared to have destroyed a weapons platform would suddenly find themselves under fire from 3 other directions as the network compensated. Attacks that should have overwhelmed the human defenses through sheer numbers instead found the numbers shifting and adapting faster than Dominion targeting systems could track. Dr. Priya Nandan, watching a delayed feed of the battle from a monitoring station on Earth, alongside dozens of other engineers who had spent 5 years building this exact system, felt something close to pride, mixed with sheer nervous exhaustion. as she watched her research finally proving itself in the worst possible circumstances. She had spent years studying how leafcutter ants coordinated foraging routes, without any single ant understanding the colony's overall strategy, how termite colonies built structures far more complex than any single insect could plan, how flocks of starlings moved as one shifting cloud without a single bird calling out directions. None of those insects had any concept of warfare, and yet the underlying principle, thousands of small parts responding to local conditions while sharing just enough information to act as a whole, had turned out to be exactly what humanity needed to face an enemy fleet 1,000 times its visible size. "It's holding," she said quietly, watching the data scroll past on her screen. "It's actually holding." Beside her, Aiden Marsh said nothing, watching the same data with the tight, focused silence of a man who understood exactly how many things still needed to go right before that sentence could be trusted. "Grand Marshal," Yusith reported, his voice tense, "our fire is not achieving expected results. The human network appears to be redistributing itself in real time. We are destroying individual platforms, but the overall defensive capability is not decreasing at the rate our models predicted." Threx studied the numbers with growing concern. His fleet was inflicting damage, that much was clear from the reports flooding in, but the pace of destruction on the human side was far slower than 3,000 ships firing continuously should have produced. Meanwhile, his own losses were beginning to climb steadily, ship after ship reporting damage, some reporting complete destruction, as the human network concentrated overwhelming fire on specific targets, with an efficiency that felt almost unnatural. "How many ships have we lost?" Threx asked. 147, Grand Marshal, with another 200 reporting significant damage. Threx's 4 eyes narrowed. In less than 10 minutes of sustained combat, he had lost more ships than in any single engagement of his 300-year career, and the humans had not yet lost a single one of their 3 crewed vessels. "This is not a fair exchange," he said quietly. "No, Grand Marshal," Yusith agreed. "It is not." On the Vanguard, Sarah Cade watched the battle unfold, with a mixture of grim satisfaction and constant, gnawing worry. The network was working exactly as designed, but working as designed did not mean the danger was gone. Even with the redistribution protocols functioning perfectly, 3,000 ships firing continuously produced an overwhelming amount of raw firepower, and the network's platforms, however cleverly deployed, were still being worn down. "Status report," she called out. "We've lost about 30% of the outer network," Osei reported, her voice strained with concentration. "The core platforms closest to us are holding. But Captain, if this keeps up at the current rate, we're looking at maybe 40 more minutes before the network starts losing effectiveness faster than it can compensate." "And the fleet's losses?" "Confirmed destruction of at least 200 Dominion ships, with more damaged. But Captain, they've still got over 2,800 ships in that formation. Even at this rate, the math doesn't favor us if it turns into a war of attrition." Cade knew this already, of course. It was the fundamental problem with the entire plan, the reason 5 years of preparation had gone into more than just the network itself. A hidden defense system, however clever, could not indefinitely withstand the direct assault of a fleet 1,000 times its visible size. It could inflict disproportionate damage. It could level a battlefield that should never have been level in the first place. But eventually, if the Dominion was willing to accept enough losses, sheer numbers would win. Which was exactly why the network was not the entire plan. "Reyes," Cade said. "Status on Nightfall?" "Still flying, still fighting," Reyes said. "Shields down to 40%, but we're holding our position in the formation." "Good, because it's time for Phase 2. Cade took a slow breath. "Osei, patch me through to Earth Command. Tell Admiral Voss the network has held long enough. We're initiating the second wave." 5 years earlier, in that same converted hangar outside Colorado Springs, the team assembled by Dr. Aiden Marsh had faced a difficult truth about their own plan. The hidden network, however sophisticated, would eventually be worn down by a fleet large enough and patient enough to accept the losses required to overwhelm it. If the Dominion committed to a pure war of attrition, the math still favored them in the end. So the plan had a second layer, one that even fewer people knew about than the network itself. Scattered throughout the asteroid belt, disguised even more thoroughly than the defensive weapons platforms, Humanity had built something far more dangerous. A small fleet of automated strike craft, faster and more heavily armed than anything in the defensive network, designed not to hold a defensive line, but to strike directly at the heart of an enemy formation. They had been built using technology reverse-engineered, in part, from wreckage the Dominion itself had left behind, during a skirmish with another alien trading vessel decades earlier. Technology humanity had quietly acquired and studied, without the Dominion ever realizing it had fallen into human hands. There were only 40 of these strike craft, far too few to face the Dominion fleet in open battle, but they were not meant to fight the whole fleet. They were meant to do one thing, and one thing only: strike directly at the Dominion flagship and its immediate escort, in the hope that removing the fleet's command structure would create enough confusion and hesitation to change the entire shape of the battle. It was, Aidan Marsh had admitted at the time, an enormous gamble. If it failed, 40 valuable strike craft would be lost for nothing, and the network would be left to face the full weight of the Dominion fleet alone. But if it succeeded, if the fleet's command and coordination could be disrupted at the critical moment, it might be enough to tip a battle that no reasonable calculation said humanity should win. The wreckage that made the strike craft possible had been recovered almost by accident, 4 years earlier, by a human research vessel studying an asteroid field on the far edge of the system. A skirmish between the Dominion and an independent trading fleet, fought decades before humanity had ever been noticed by either side, had left drifting debris scattered across a wide stretch of space, long since abandoned and forgotten by everyone, except the quiet automated systems that had recorded its position. When human engineers recovered pieces of a damaged Dominion engine core, they had not fully understood what they had found, until Dr. Wen Zhao spent almost a year carefully reverse-engineering its principles, translating alien engineering into something human factories could actually build. It was, in its own way, a fitting irony that some of the same technology the Dominion had once used to expand its empire would end up forming the heart of the weapons built to resist it. Aidan Marsh had pointed this out once, during a late-night planning session, and Elena Voss had simply shrugged and said that if the universe was going to hand humanity an unfair fight, she saw no reason not to take whatever advantage it offered in return. "All right," Elena Voss had said, standing at the head of that meeting 5 years earlier. "We build it, all of it. The network, the strike craft, all of it. If we're going to fight a fleet 1,000 times our size, we're not doing it with half a plan." Now, as the battle raged in the space above Earth, 40 small strike craft that had spent months hidden inside the hulls of decommissioned mining vessels drifting quietly through the asteroid belt began, one by one, to separate from their disguises and power up their engines. Each strike craft carried a crew of exactly one, a volunteer pilot who had spent the last 2 years training for a mission that, until this moment, had existed only in simulations. They were, almost without exception, young, some barely out of flight school, chosen as much for their willingness to accept an extraordinarily dangerous assignment as for their raw piloting skill. Among them was a 26-year-old former commercial pilot from Manila, named Isabel Cruz, who had left a stable job flying passenger routes across Southeast Asia the moment recruiters explained, in careful and deliberately vague terms, that Earth needed pilots willing to fly missions nobody could guarantee they would survive. As her strike craft's engines powered up and its stealth housing fell away, Isabel felt the same mixture of terror and focus that had carried her through 2 years of brutal training. She glanced at a small photograph taped to the edge of her console, her parents standing outside their house in Manila, and allowed herself exactly 1 second to think about them before turning her full attention to the tactical display and the enormous shape of the undying resolve growing larger ahead of her. "Strike Wing, this is Cruz," she said over the encrypted channel shared by all 40 pilots. "Formation Delta. On my mark. Let's make this count." On the bridge of the undying resolve, sensor officers were far too occupied tracking the chaos of the ongoing battle with the network to notice 40 small, fast-moving objects breaking away from the asteroid belt and beginning a high-speed approach vector directly toward the flagship's position. "Grand Marshal," Yisith reported. "Fleet losses now stand at 263 ships, with over 400 more reporting damage. The human network continues to redistribute effectively, despite our sustained fire." Threx studied the numbers grimly. His fleet still held an overwhelming numerical advantage, but the pace of losses was unlike anything he had experienced, and his officers' reports carried an undertone of unease that he had rarely heard from Dominion crews in 3 centuries of service. "Continue the advance," he said. "We will break their network eventually, whatever the cost." "Grand Marshal," a new voice called out, this one carrying genuine alarm. "Unidentified contacts, 40 vessels, high speed, approaching the flagship's position directly. They were not present on any previous scan." Threx turned sharply toward the tactical display, watching as 40 small red markers appeared, moving with startling speed directly toward the heart of his formation, toward his own flagship. "Concentrate defensive fire," he ordered immediately. "Protect the flagship. All escort vessels, intercept those craft before they reach engagement range." But the strike craft had been designed, over 5 years, for exactly this moment. Built with speed and maneuverability that outclassed even the Dominion's fastest interceptors. As Dominion escort ships scrambled to respond, the 40 human strike craft split into smaller groups, weaving through the chaos of the larger battle, using the confusion of the ongoing network engagement to mask their approach until it was almost too late to stop them. "Grand Marshal," Yisith said, his voice tight with something Threx had never heard from him before. "I do not believe we can intercept all of them before they reach effective weapons range." Threx Kalor, 300 years a commander, undefeated in every war he had ever fought, looked at the tactical display and understood, for the first time since the battle began, that he might be about to lose. "Then we prepare for what comes next," he said quietly. "And we hope it is not as bad as it looks." Around the flagship, Dominion crews braced for impact, weapons officers redirecting whatever defensive fire they could spare toward the incoming strike craft, while the rest of the fleet continued its grinding, costly assault on the human network. Threx watched the small red markers on his display close the final distance, weaving through a storm of defensive fire that claimed a handful more of them, but could not stop the majority from reaching their targets. He thought, in that last moment before the strike craft opened fire, of every battle he had ever won, and of how easy victory had always seemed compared to this. He had faced larger fleets, and smarter commanders, and enemies with weapons more advanced than anything the Dominion possessed. He had never once faced an enemy that seemed to understand, better than the Dominion itself, how to make a small force feel impossibly large, and an enormous force feel suddenly, dangerously fragile. Around the undying resolve, the last line of Dominion escort ships scrambled desperately to intercept 40 small human strike craft closing in fast, while 3,000 ships continued to burn against a network that refused to break. And on 3 small human ships at the heart of it all, 3 captains watched the battle reach its most dangerous moment yet. Of the 40 human strike craft that broke away from their hiding places in the asteroid belt, 11 were destroyed before they reached the undying resolve, caught by frantic Dominion escort ships that managed, at the last moment, to put themselves in the way. It was a heavy loss, more than Aiden Marsh's engineers had hoped for, but it was not enough to stop what came next. 29 strike craft reached weapons range of the Dominion flagship. Isabel Cruz was among them. She brought her small craft in low across the flagship's hull, weaving between bursts of point defense fire that had already claimed 2 of the pilots flying beside her only seconds earlier. Her hands were steady despite everything, 2 years of training taking over where fear might otherwise have paralyzed her, and she released her payload exactly where months of study of Dominion ship designs had told her to aim. They did not attack the ship's hull directly, though its heavy armor could likely have withstood their weapons for some time regardless. Instead, following a plan refined over hundreds of simulations back on Earth, they targeted something more specific: the flagship's communication and coordination systems, the arrays that allowed the undying resolve to relay orders and tactical data to the rest of the fleet in real time. It was not a killing blow. It did not need to be. For nearly 3 minutes, as the strike craft pressed their attack, and the flagship's own defenses scrambled to fight them off, the undying resolve lost its ability to coordinate with the wider Dominion fleet. 3 minutes was not a long time in the scale of a battle involving thousands of ships. But 3 minutes, at exactly the wrong moment, was enough. On the bridge of the undying resolve, Grand Marshal Threx Kalor watched his communication displays flicker and fail, as the strike craft's attack disrupted the flagship's systems. Around him, officers who had spent 3 centuries relying on constant, precise coordination between every ship in a Dominion fleet suddenly found themselves cut off from the larger battle, unable to relay new orders, unable to receive updated reports. "Restore communications," he ordered, though he could see his own officers working frantically at their stations, already doing everything possible. "Working on it, Grand Marshal," Yusith said. "The strike craft's attack has damaged primary and secondary relay systems. Engineering estimates 3 to 5 minutes for full restoration." 3 to 5 minutes. In a battle where the human network had already demonstrated an ability to adapt and redirect its firepower in real time, 3 to 5 minutes without central coordination was an eternity. Across the vast formation of Dominion warships, individual captains, suddenly cut off from the flagship's guidance, were forced to make their own decisions about how to continue the engagement. Some pressed forward aggressively, following the last orders they had received. Others, more cautious, pulled back slightly, uncertain whether to continue the assault without clear direction from command. The result, across a fleet of nearly 3,000 ships, was not chaos exactly, but something almost as dangerous: a sudden loss of the unified coordination that had made the Dominion's numerical advantage so overwhelming in the first place. Isabel Cruz did not stay to watch the results of her attack. Following her training, she pulled her strike craft away from the flagship immediately, weaving back through the chaos toward the rendezvous point, where nightfall waited to cover the survivors' retreat. Of the 29 strike craft that had reached the flagship, only 18 would make it back to Earth's outer defenses. The rest were lost in the desperate scramble of Dominion escort ships, trying, too late, to protect their command vessel. It was a heavy price, and one that every person involved in the mission's planning had understood from the beginning. But as the flagship's communications flickered and failed, it became clear that the sacrifice had bought exactly what humanity needed. The human network, still fully coordinated through the 3 crewed ships at its heart, seized the opening immediately. "Now," Sarah Cade said, watching the Dominion formation's coordination falter on her tactical display. "Osei, concentrate everything on the ships nearest the flagship. Reyes, move Nightfall to support the strike craft survivors and cover their retreat." "Copy that," Reyes said, already adjusting course. "Concentrating fire now," Osei confirmed, her voice tight with focus as she redirected the network's full offensive capability toward the cluster of Dominion ships surrounding the temporarily blind flagship. For those 3 critical minutes, the battle shifted decisively. Dominion ships that had lost contact with Central Command found themselves facing a coordinated, adaptive enemy, while operating on outdated orders and incomplete information. Losses that had been climbing steadily throughout the engagement suddenly accelerated. By the time the Undying Resolve's communications came back online, the Dominion fleet had lost another 180 ships, and the surviving formation had been pushed into a ragged, uncertain shape that bore little resemblance to the disciplined wall of warships that had entered the system hours earlier. When communications were finally restored, Grand Marshal Threx Kalor looked at the updated tactical display and felt something he had not felt in 300 years of unbroken victories. He felt the shape of defeat. "Total losses, Grand Marshal," Yusith reported, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. 443 ships confirmed destroyed. Another 600 reporting significant damage. The fleet's coordination has been disrupted across nearly a third of our formation. Threx said nothing for a long moment, studying the numbers, the ragged shape of his once perfect formation, the 3 small human ships still holding their position at the heart of a network that had cost him, in a matter of hours, more than he had lost in the previous 3 centuries combined. "And the humans?" he asked finally. "Their 3 crewed vessels remain fully operational, Grand Marshal. We estimate they have lost approximately 60% of the hidden weapons platforms in their network, along with most of their strike craft. But their core capability remains intact. 60% of the network destroyed, and still the humans had not lost a single crewed ship, while his own fleet had suffered losses that would take Dominion shipyards years to fully replace." Threx thought about Ambassador Sethranar's words from months earlier, about a species that rarely acted without reason, that had spent 5 years quietly building something the Dominion's own intelligence had entirely failed to detect. He thought about the confidence in Captain Cade's voice during that first transmission, the calm certainty of someone who already understood exactly how this battle would unfold. "Grand Marshal," Yusith said carefully. "Orders?" Threx Kalor had commanded fleets for 300 years. and in 300 years he had learned that the difference between a great commander and a foolish one was not the ability to win every battle. It was the ability to recognize, clearly and without pride getting in the way, when a battle could not be won at an acceptable cost, and when continuing to fight would only ensure a defeat far worse than a strategic withdrawal. He thought of the Cathari uprising, decades earlier, when a rival commander had refused to withdraw from a losing engagement out of pure stubbornness and had lost nearly his entire fleet as a result. A defeat still studied in Dominion war academies as an example of pride overruling judgment. He had promised himself, watching that disaster unfold as a younger officer, that he would never let his own ego cost lives that could otherwise be saved. 3,000 ships remained a formidable force, more than enough to hold and eventually rebuild from this engagement. But continuing to grind against a network that adapted faster than his fleet could compensate, especially now that its command structure had proven vulnerable to the kind of decisive strike the humans had just demonstrated, would only mean throwing away more lives for a victory that grew less certain by the minute. It was not an easy decision. In 300 years, he had never once given the order to withdraw from an active engagement, and some distant part of him, the part that had built a career and a reputation on never losing, resisted the words even as he spoke them. "Signal the fleet," he said quietly. "Full withdrawal. We are leaving this system." Yisith did not argue, though Threx could see the surprise in his posture. In 300 years, the undying resolve had never once retreated from a battle. "Yes, Grand Marshal," Yisith said, and the order went out. Aboard the Vanguard, Sarah Cade watched the Dominion fleet begin its withdrawal with a mixture of exhausted relief and disbelief that it had actually worked. "Captain," Osei's voice came through, sounding just as tired. "Confirmed. The entire Dominion fleet is reversing course. They're leaving the system." Cade allowed herself, finally, a long breath she felt like she had been holding for 5 years. "Copy that," she said. "All units, do not pursue. Let them go. We're not here to destroy them. We're here to make sure they understand Earth isn't an easy target." "I think that message has been received." "Understatement of the century," Reyes said over the channel, and despite everything, Cade found herself almost laughing at the exhaustion in his voice. "Get Earth Command on the line," Cade said. "Let's tell Admiral Voss the fleet is withdrawing." In the underground command center beneath Geneva, Elena Voss received the news with the entire room around her, erupting into a kind of stunned, exhausted celebration that she had almost forgotten was possible, after months of preparing for what had felt, even with the best plan they could build, like a battle Earth might not survive. "Confirmed," Diego Ferreira reported, his voice cracking slightly with relief. "Dominion fleet is withdrawing, Admiral. All remaining ships reversing course, heading back toward the outer system." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself, briefly, to feel the weight of 5 years of work finally lifting from her shoulders. Around her, officers who had spent days running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline hugged each other, some crying openly, others simply sitting down in their chairs for the first time in hours, too exhausted for anything more than quiet relief. Dr. Aidan Marsh sat down heavily at an empty console, staring at the tactical display, without really seeing it anymore. 5 years of his life, and the lives of thousands of engineers who had trusted a plan they were never fully allowed to understand, had come down to this single, exhausting day, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, it had actually worked. "Casualties?" Elena asked, opening her eyes again. "All 3 crewed ships report minimal damage, no casualties," Aidan Marsh said, reading from his own screen. "We lost the majority of the strike craft and about 60% of the network platforms, but Admiral, given what we were facing, that's about as good an outcome as we could have realistically hoped for." Elena nodded slowly, looking at the tactical display where 3,000 Dominion warships had shrunk, over the course of a single battle, to just over 2,500, retreating steadily back toward the edge of the system they had entered with such overwhelming confidence. "Get me a channel to Ambassador Sethranar," she said. "Let's see what our victory actually bought us." Sethranar's face appeared on the screen a few minutes later, and Elena could see immediately that he understood exactly what had happened, even before she said a word. "Admiral Voss," he said quietly, "I understand the Grand Marshal has ordered a full withdrawal." "He has," Elena confirmed. "I will admit," Sethranar said, that in 11 years of studying your species, I did not fully understand the danger of underestimating you until today. I do not believe the Dominion High Council will be pleased with this outcome. I imagine not, Elena said, but I hope they'll be sensible about it. Earth isn't interested in fighting an endless war with the Dominion, Ambassador. We built what we built because we didn't have a choice, not because we wanted this. If your council is willing to negotiate a real treaty, one that respects Earth's independence, we're willing to talk. Sethranar was quiet for a long moment. I will relay that message, Admiral. I cannot promise how it will be received. The Dominion has never lost a first engagement like this in living memory, and I do not know how the High Council will choose to respond to that. But I will tell you honestly, as someone who has come, over these 11 years, to respect your people a great deal, I hope they choose peace. So do I, Elena said. So do I. In the months that followed, word of the battle spread slowly through the wider galaxy, carried by trade ships and diplomatic channels between the many species that had dealings with the Varathi Dominion. A newly discovered species, technologically primitive by galactic standards, had faced a Dominion invasion fleet outnumbered 1,000 to 1, and had not only survived, but had forced that fleet into a full retreat, inflicting losses the Dominion had not suffered in centuries. The story grew and changed as it traveled, the way stories always do, until versions of it reached species who had never heard of Earth and would likely never encounter a human being in their lifetimes. Some versions exaggerated the numbers further, describing 100 human ships instead of 3, or a fleet of 10,000 Dominion warships instead of 3. Other versions stripped away the details of the network entirely, reducing 5 years of careful engineering to a single vague notion that humans possessed some unknown, unstoppable weapon. But underneath all the exaggeration, one detail remained consistent across every retelling, and it was the detail that mattered most to the many smaller species who had spent generations living under the shadow of Dominion expansion. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, someone had said no to the Dominion, and made it stick. For those smaller species, the story became something more than gossip carried along trade routes. It became a quiet source of hope, whispered in places the Dominion could not easily monitor, a reminder that the Empire's endless expansion was not, in fact, unstoppable, and that a species willing to think differently about strength might yet find a way to stand its ground. The Dominion High Council, faced with the reality of what had happened and unwilling to commit the resources for a second, far more costly attempt, eventually agreed to open formal negotiations with Earth, not as a conquered world seeking mercy, but as an independent power that had earned, through 5 years of quiet, desperate ingenuity, a seat at the table on its own terms. Grand Marshal Threx Kalor never commanded another invasion fleet. The Dominion High Council, embarrassed by the scale of the losses and unwilling to publicly admit that their most trusted commander had been outmaneuvered by a species they had dismissed as primitive, quietly reassigned him to an advisory role within the Dominion's war academies, where he spent the remaining decades of his long career studying the battle above Earth, trying to understand exactly how a species so far behind the Dominion in raw technology had managed to build something his own intelligence services had never detected, something that had turned an overwhelming numerical advantage into a costly, humiliating retreat. He taught generations of young Dominion officers using the battle as a case study, insisting, against the objections of colleagues who preferred to treat the defeat as an unfortunate accident rather than a lesson, that it represented something the Dominion could not afford to ignore. Numbers alone, he argued in lecture after lecture, were no longer a guarantee of victory in a galaxy that contained species capable of the kind of ingenuity humanity had shown. Most of his students listened politely and moved on to other lessons. A few, over the years, took the warning seriously and quietly began pushing for changes in how the Dominion approached newly discovered species going forward. Changes that would take decades to fully take hold, but that could be traced back, in no small part, to one commander's stubborn insistence on learning from a single humiliating defeat. He never fully found an answer that satisfied him, though late in his life, in a private journal that would eventually be studied by historians across a dozen species, he wrote something that came closer to the truth than any tactical analysis ever could. "They did not win because they were stronger than us," he wrote. "They won because they understood, better than we ever gave them credit for, that strength is not always about how many ships you can build. Sometimes it is about how well you can make a few ships matter more than 3,000. On Earth, the 3 ships that had defended humanity's independence returned home to a planet that would never quite be the same again. Sarah Cade, Tomas Reyes, and Amara Osei became names that every schoolchild on the planet would eventually learn, not as perfect heroes in some old story, but as ordinary people who had done an extraordinary job with everything they had been given. Cade retired from active command 2 years later, spending her remaining working years training the next generation of officers who would need to think about warfare in ways her own generation had been forced to invent under pressure. She made a point, in every class she taught, of reminding her students that the battle above Earth had not been won by 3 ships alone, but by thousands of engineers, factory workers, and ordinary people who had trusted a plan they were never fully allowed to understand, and who had built something extraordinary anyway, simply because the alternative was unacceptable. Reyes stayed in active service longer, eventually taking command of Earth's expanded defense fleet as humanity, newly aware of just how large and dangerous the galaxy truly was, began building a more permanent and visible force to stand alongside the hidden network that had saved them once already. Osei left military service entirely within a year of the battle, returning to civilian life, and eventually founding a company that adapted the network's coordination principles for use in disaster response and infrastructure management, insisting, whenever asked about it, that the same ideas that had once saved a planet from invasion could just as easily help rebuild one after a hurricane or an earthquake. And somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in the quiet dark where a listening post had first detected an approaching fleet 5 years earlier, humanity kept watching, kept building, kept preparing, not for war exactly, but for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing that battle had taught them, it was that the galaxy was far larger and far more dangerous than anyone on Earth had truly understood. But it had also taught them something else, something that mattered just as much. They were not as small as they had once believed.